Is Beau Larimer, and I am the host of the CoffeeProf podcast, which is a podcast series I started for my university class at California State University of Bakersfield, where I teach in the evenings. The course is learning how to become an English language arts high school teacher. And so today, since with all the coronavirus craziness, they haven't been able to observe classes with school closures. So I've been interviewing some of the instructors around Bakersfield or administrators or educational experts who really know the craft of teaching well in different arenas or different elements of the craft. So we've talked about a lot of different things on this podcast, but today we're going to be discussing with Dr. Jill Hamilton Bunch about how to best teach focused instruction, which is technically the lecture part of a lesson, or where the instructor would explain the purpose of the lesson along with modeling any particular skill students are going to practice for that lesson. And so she's going to talk about how to develop very purposeful, focused lessons or direct instruction that engages students, and then talk about how to move from that piece of a lesson or that piece of instruction into guided instruction or small group teaching, where you're working with students who need a little bit more support or need a little bit more challenge, and then also facilitating plenty of independent and collaborative practice as well. And then in part one, and really I have to split this into two parts because I couldn't cut anything out of this awesome interview. I can't imagine cutting anything out. So she's going to talk about that instructional design element I mentioned, and then she's also going to talk about some of the essentials of helping students engage in true note-taking and not simply copying, which she points out is not a national California standard, but being able to summarize, being able to write to learn truly and engage your thinking skills as you process during a focused lesson, and engage with a lesson along with having a product to go back and review and learn from after that particular piece of instruction is so important. And she talks about exactly how to do that. So that's part one. And then part two, we're going to explore writing instruction in depth, how to utilize a mentor text, or look at how an instructor can model a writing move, or looking at a mentor text shows us that writing move, and then move from noticing good elements of writing, showing and modeling with students how to read like a writer and notice those writing moves in an excellent piece of writing, and then moving into here's how you would imitate those writing moves in shared writing, where you bring the students into the writing process with the instructor and they share that process in a way that's engaging, but also helps the students see how it works. And then finally, she has some words of wisdom about how to best facilitate collaborative writing experiences, especially in the revision process. So that's part 1 and 2. Hope you really enjoy part 1. Part 2 is awesome as well. At the end of part 2, we are going to discuss a little bit about how resilience and reflection can really serve new teachers and all teachers really well in having a healthy and thriving educational career. All right, I hope you enjoy today.
All right. I always like pause because they don't give me a countdown, but we are recording now. I am the host of the CoffeeProf podcast for my CSUB class, and I am honored today during Teacher Appreciation Week to chat with Dr. Jill Hamilton Bunch, who is one of my favorite teachers. Sometimes when I go to PD, my students say, where are you going? And I said, teacher school. And they're always surprised that teachers still go to school. I'm like, yeah, I still go to school. So I remember doing some PD with you, and I was changed so much of what I did in class. So a lot of today I'm going to be talking about instructional design, teaching writing, and some tips for new teachers, really based on some of what I've learned from you. And real briefly, I am in my classroom, and it's crazy. I have found that my...
Can I stop us real quick? I'm
Oh,
going to
yeah,
let
no problem.
him back out really quick. Sorry. He
No
is
problem. I will just pause it and we can start back up. All right, so real brief break there, but as I was saying, the laptop setup that I have at home while checking emails and Google Classroom occasionally is not the best for doing Zoom interviews, which anyone who's watched these other podcasts has already figured out based on how they look sometimes. So I am here, but it's just me, and I'm being very careful, and hand sanitizer bottle is right here, so no worries there. So I want to get into what we're talking about today. You have done quite a bit of classroom teaching yourself at the secondary level, and currently you have moved on up to be the Associate Dean of the School of Ed for Point Loma University. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, real briefly, your story through your educational career.
Okay, I don't know if our little break will probably be in the podcast, and Beau and I were just talking about the unique experience of being on Zoom from home for sure. So as Beau said, I'm Jill Hamilton Bunch, and I am the Associate Dean for the School of Ed at Point Loma. And I actually was a student at Point Loma in San Diego, and was recruited to teach in a town called Delano. I now know it was Delano. 30 years ago. My first year of teaching was 1990. And I actually was an English major who knew I wanted to be an English teacher. So I got my degree and my credential at the same time, and then was recruited from Delano in San Diego from Delano. So I actually interviewed in San Diego. So the first time I had ever been to Delano was the first day that I was employed there. So I signed my contract and everything all from San Diego. So yeah, it was quite an adventure. I was single and done with my credential. And so I just thought, oh, this will be a fun adventure. I'll do this. And never imagining that 30 years later, I would still be here, which is, the best choice I've ever made. So I was super excited about that. I'm not from the area, so it really was just an adventure. And I think probably the most important part of my journey was just figuring out that I was 22 when I started, and so I knew I was going to learn forever. I don't think I realized how much I was going to learn forever. I think I thought I would get to a spot in my career where I was like, okay, now I've got that, figured out. But because kids are changing and context is changing and technology is changing, I think the coolest thing about this profession, I think two things are my favorite about teaching. The first is that you never, ever, ever learn everything you're going to ever need to know. You're always going to learn something new. And the second is every year is a fresh start. You really do get like a do-over, or not even a do-over, probably not a do-over, but a fresh start. And you don't get that in a normal context. If you work in an office, you don't get a fresh start with brand new people every year. So I think those are probably my most favorite things about teaching.
I have to agree with you on that. Another pupil of yours, as a kind of you taught in the secondary level, and then you taught teachers how to teach. And so another teacher who you taught how to teach named Troy, I talked to last week. And that was part of our conversation is we were talking about, it was education and technology, and how you really have to remember that you're modeling learning for the student. And whether that's learning reading or learning how to use technology, or we talked about project-based learning, and whether you're learning how to do filmmaking, or I remember last year I did an infographic activity, and I was learning how to do an infographic right along with them, and that's fine. It's okay to share that experience with them. In fact, it's a great model for what we want them to end up being. So that is awesome. I have just one follow-up question because I know this about you. So Delano, primarily Hispanic, and I know that you speak Spanish so fluently. You even presented in Spain. You mentioned that. Did you learn prior to going to Delano, or was that a process as once you became a teacher, working with a Hispanic population and working and interacting with that culture sometimes, and working with EL students? Did you learn Spanish at that point?
Well, that's where I always say that's where I really learned. So yeah, that's like one of my favorite stories. I don't know that I mean, we know each other very well, but I don't know that I've ever told you this story. When I was in 8th grade, if you were a good reader, you only had to take half a year of reading. So you took an English class and a reading class. And if you read well enough, if you're above grade level, you only took half a year of reading. So at the semester, at Christmas, you got to take an elective. And I had 3 choices: metal shop, wood shop, and Spanish. So I was not super interested in wood shop, but I thought metal shop kind of sounded interesting. But my neighbor said, well, the boys heat up pennies and in the grinder and throw hot pennies if girls take metal shop. So don't take metal shop. It's not safe. So I honestly was trying to decide between metal shop and Spanish. Because both sounded really interesting to me. And I chose Spanish because I thought, well, okay, well, I can't have hot pennies flying at my face. So yeah, I chose Spanish and loved it. And I love language. I've always loved language. And that was really the beginning of my journey. I had a really forward-thinking Spanish teacher. We had no book. We didn't do any conjugation. We played grocery store and we played restaurant and we played
real immersive process.
Immersive. Yeah. It was like going to Spain or going to Mexico or, any Spanish speaking country. And so I really learned very quickly and picked up on it. And he only spoke Spanish to us. It was very, very good. And then I had, predictably, some great Spanish teachers and some not so great, but I did take it all the way through school. So I will call myself, I was a school learned Spanish speaker. And then when I taught in Delano, then I became what I would call an actual, in real life, Spanish speaker. Because I just used it more often and I used it in context, which really truly was what pushed me, into really feeling confident and fluent.
Yeah,
so,
that's
that was
awesome.
My journey. Probably the most common to get asked.
Yeah, I always tell my students, I think sometimes they forget how cool that is to be bilingual, right? It's such an important thing, and it helps your thinking and helps you appreciate language in a different way and culture in a different way. I always try and encourage them of that.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about a couple different things today, so we'll kind of move into that. The first thing we're going to talk about, because in class we've mentioned the gradual release of responsibility, Fisher and Fry, and their first step, focused instruction, or as has often been called, direct instruction, focuses on the lecture part of a lesson, would fit in that category. But more and more when you're talking about reading and writing skills, there's a lot of modeling and explanation of that practice of think aloud or modeling writing or noticing things, along with direct explanation. When I have found it challenging, I remember that first year teaching, sometimes it can be challenging to keep the student engaged during that process. Even, for example, right, you're modeling something about introductions, or I remember doing a real brief explanation of irony. How do you keep the students from checking out? So I would say, get out your notebook, get out your pen, and then have my slides and I'm explaining things. And then students would say, hey, wait, don't move slides yet. We're copying down the slide. And you'll see kids go, they finish copying and then kind of check out, and your explanations kind of nothing's happening. So I was wondering if we could talk about that first, kind of the process of engaging students during, obviously I've mentioned before, you want to keep those focused lessons short because the attention span of adolescents, as with most people, is pretty short. But how do you, number one, try and keep them engaged and show that modeling? And then number two, kind of as an engagement strategy, how do you teach note-taking as a true skill? And a true invisible process of how you're thinking behind that note-taking, how you're summarizing and synthesizing information. How do you teach that and stay away from these students going, okay, I'm just copying a record that is being shared with me?
Right.
That would be a great place to start.
Well, and you've heard me say before, Beau, that if copying were a California state standard, we'd all be at grade level, right? Because that's what we've asked kids to copy a lot. And To what end? Copying is not a state standard, in fact. So I'm going to give you just like a little list of what I would say the critical pieces for direct instruction. The first one is if it's single subject secondary, we're going to be in a junior high or a high school, and it shouldn't be any longer than 15 minutes. That's about what the kids can take in a quote unquote lecture. And so there's really no
just
lecture.
To add to that point, I just stumbled across this year and I was like, oh, that's so interesting and relatable. TED Talks, they have an 18-minute limit. You're not allowed to go above 18 minutes as a kind of a general standard. And I thought, well, that's really speaks to how we should look at lecturing.
I did not know that fact, but it makes perfect sense, right? Because that's about what we can do even as adults. So the first thing is just thinking about that time. The other thing is buy a timer or use your phone or whatever, and don't talk for more than 5 minutes. So 5 minutes of teacher talk, and then give them at least 1 minute for student processing. So whether that's turning and talking to someone else, whether that's jotting something down, whether that's asking a clarifying question, all those are different ways that we can help kids stay engaged. I think the most important thing, and I'm an introvert in my core, so I was that kid who never spoke in class unless I got called on. So I am always sensitive about this, but I had index cards with the kids' pictures on them. So, it's Beau Larimer and then your picture from Synergy. And that way I could memorize names. I had 192 kids like we all do.
Keep going, I'm going to grab something.
Okay, I wanted to put their name with their face. When you have a lot of kids, that's a quick way to learn that. And then I could shuffle those cards and say, okay, there you go. And mine were color-coded. Beau listens, and that's why I like them. So first period was one color, just like you have. And then I had volunteer cards. I had 2 volunteer cards in a stack of 32 kids. And there they are, right there. And yours even have like symbols on them.
And awesome. Told them to add a doodle or something. Yeah, I like the idea of having a picture on them because that would help me learn the names real quickly. But it's good to see their personality a little bit.
It was really helpful. And like the other thing I did was I just put like a note on there. Like if they were absent, I would put a little note in there, and it helped me to see like even patterns. Like the student's been out quite a bit, or like, they're out on Mondays. I mean, just any kind of thing that you want to keep track of. And that let my kids know that when I tell you to, process real quickly, it's going to be quick, but it's going to be accountable. And I did have kids who were like, oh, I hated, I was always so nervous you were going to call on me. And I think the key is to create a culture where it's not scary, because we're so engaged and conversational that calling on someone doesn't feel like you're victimizing them. And I think that's really important. So some kind of accountability, and the volunteer card was so that the kids were super excited to share. And I was also that kid, strangely, who was also like really excited to share information at times.
But just real quick, you typically, I talk about cold calling and warm calling. I always I warm call, like they have the process time first, right? That would be important, right? You have that time to write some of your thinking down, or even just a couple moments to collect your thoughts, or speak to the person beside you, and then go into kind of, okay, I'm going to share to the whole class possibly.
Yeah, because cold calling doesn't serve an instructional purpose. And I always want to make that super clear. It doesn't matter how quickly you can answer, it matters how well you answer. So I don't ever want to cold call on kids, because I really don't care that you remember that, the whiteness of the whale and what it means, like that. I care that you can figure it out. And again, we've overvalued in some ways response times that are quick. That's why wait time's key. I mean, I could talk for hours about the importance of wait time, but also you can wait forever. If they don't know it, they don't know it. That's why processing is so critical, because that gives you a better feel for, do they not know it, or do they just need a minute to figure it out? So I think that's really important. The other thing is, my instruction is followed by letting you make a choice of how you're going to do the actual work. So I'm teaching you about introductions, and today we're going to practice writing introductions. My kids then knew, some of you, if you need the extra help, we're going to stay with me, and we're going to work together, and I'll work with you. or you can work with a partner, or you can work alone. So you've heard me say this before, Beau. My thing I said to the kids after instruction, so I've done 5-minute bursts, no more than 15 minutes. And then I say, here's the task. With the knowledge that you have, you can saddle up and work alone. You can buddy up and work with a partner, or you can round up and work with me. And what that did is it held my kids accountable for listening, because they could make a choice about how much support they needed. So my top kids, who were often like, I already know about introductions, they were motivated to stay engaged in the direct instruction, the focused instruction, because they wanted to make sure that they understood it well enough to do it alone. And those high achieving kids always wanted to work alone if they could. They didn't want to have to wait for someone else. Whereas my kind of middle of the pack kids wanted to work together. And then I always had a group of kids who needed to work with me, or just wanted to work with me. So that helped them be engaged, because they understood that I was going to release them, and they wanted to be ready for that release. So that really was the best way to get them involved in the learning. The other thing was
making it very purposeful, right? Saying, okay, whatever we're doing here, I'm showing you how to do it. I'm thinking out the process. I'm practicing the skill. All right, your turn, kind of thing.
The other thing I wanted to make sure of is that I never said, hey, you guys, you're going to need to write introductions in college, so we're going to write those now. Or you're going to need to write introductions your junior year, so we're going to do them here in sophomore year. Instead, I would say, I've been looking at introductions, and here are the things that we do well, and here are the things we're not doing as well. So I was very clear with them that my direct instruction, my focused instruction, was based on what I was seeing in their writing or their reading. So that it wasn't this like, in 10 years you'll need this, or next year you'll need this. It was, I've seen this pattern, and so I'm teaching this. So what that means is I based my focused instruction on what I was seeing in their work. And then I told them.
So really you could describe it as a kind of a mini lesson, providing feedback to specific, like responsive to what the skill and where they're at.
Exactly. And every lesson in my room was a mini lesson. I never did like, oh, here's my PowerPoint I had from last year, and I'm going to do it again this year. And that's from the work of Nancy Atwell. Her book was called In the Middle. And I was actually trained with that in pre-service. I still have like my 32-year-old copy of the book. It has been updated a million times. But Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle, who do so much work with secondary English, their work is based on Nancy Atwell's work. So that's where I learned that. Yeah, I think the most important thing is don't start letting them make choices until your classroom management is solid. So
Awesome.
I started with whole class at first. I didn't let them make those choices until they could control the circuit.
Yeah. So we're going to move, you mentioned kind of how you would shift from that to guided instruction and collaborative learning, and that being flexible, right? Independent learning, collaborative learning. But before we do that, I want to just push a little bit more on note-taking. So did you, primarily when you taught note-taking, I remember in service at Independence a couple years ago, you mentioned something about summarizing being so important, and as like almost a processing skill. And I know that was a new idea to me, because I used to think of summary as this kind of simplistic skill, but then the more that I've taught summarizing, the more I understand writing and understand note-taking. I'm like, no, this is kind of the fundamental thing everything's built on. And then I think you mentioned comparison contrast also in that same kind of comment. Could you mention how that would relate to teaching note-taking?
Yes. Okay. So I got so excited I started clapping. That's how excited I was right there. Okay. So first of all, you can't listen and write at the same time. When you are writing a note, you are stepping out of the lecture, or you're stepping out of the information. And then you write your note and you step back in. So proficient note takers are just taking that second to write the note that's going to make sense to them, and then they're listening back in. Kids,
right? I've used the word toggling. You're like toggling in and out. Yeah.
I use the word switch task. You're switching from one task to another. So when you have that kid, and I remember totally that kid who, you go to the next slide and they're like, oh, I didn't get it copied. And you're like all irritated.
And sometimes the whole class is like, what? He's been talking on this one for 5 minutes. What?
Yeah. And in my head, I'm like, hide your annoyance.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that kid was listening and really engaged and asking good questions to the detriment of getting it copied. So I actually have stolen this idea from several people. First of all, pencils down, listen in. So when I'm talking about whatever the note is, you're not writing, you're just listening. I'm having you talk about it. I'm calling on kids randomly in that warm fashion. I'm having them talk to each other. And then I say, okay, pencils up. I turn off the slide and I say, just write down 3 things that matter to you. Or as we were beginning that journey, I'd say, write down 1 thing you want to remember. And just 1 thing. And now they're not distracted by like, oh, I have to write her words, or even I have to write every word. And that way they can switch tasks. And then I love that you brought up my favorite piece of research. And this is from Marzano's work. And they talk about the importance of the 3 skills that we use to learn. And it has to do with learning theory, like how we learn something new. And I call this the I went on vacation theory of instruction. When I went to Spain, and you and I have talked about me going to Spain, and you were like, how was Spain? And I said, oh, I loved Spain, the architecture. So I gave you a brief summary of Spain. And then I said, I was surprised by how much Madrid reminded me of Bakersfield, kind of the topography. So I make a comparison, and then I say what I was also surprised by how Spain was different than I would thought would be, or other places I've been. And when you travel, you really notice that. Like you say, oh, parts of Georgia look like parts of Italy to me.
Right. Me going to Alabama where there's trees all of a sudden, and growing up primarily in Bakersfield where not so many trees. I was like, that's the difference that stuck out. Yeah.
Crazy. And I remember I'm originally from Kansas, and the first time my husband saw Kansas, he's like, wow, this is really flat. And it never occurred to me how different Kansas is than here, because I've grown up both places. And so, yeah, for him, who grew up in California where there are mountains everywhere, seeing something that flat was just so shocking to him. So our brain takes in how things are the same and how they're different, and then summarizes it, and that's how we learn. So you cannot overteach, compare, contrast, and summarize, because you're really teaching kids how to learn information that you're not teaching them today. You're teaching them how to learn forever. So I just always think about what you do when you travel. That's what you're doing. You summarize it based on the comparison and contrast of other places you've been.
Yeah, and to add to that, when I really started to think about summarizing is as difficult as the complexity in text that you're summarizing. I remember summarizing by something by Jacques Derrida as a junior in college, and thinking, this is the hardest thing I have ever done in college so far.
Right.
And I was like, how do I re-say this in any kind of other way than he said it? So important. I know when I took your cohort, you mentioned how you would plan very intentionally the pencils down, pencils up approach, because you really don't, the risk is you go 9 minutes, pencils down, and you've lost them completely. So you have to establish a pace of like, you're listening, and then you're immediately going to be accountable for it. So they feel that that's commonly going to happen. And they're really flexing that move of going, I'm listening. Okay. What do I think about this? What did I notice? Which is so important.
There's an accountability in that cadence, right? And I knew that I'd done that well enough when I would have a sub, like I was at teacher school, as you said, like doing PD, and I would get back and the kids were like, and then he just talked and he kept the thing on, and we couldn't, we're like, where's the part where you turn it off? When they start to understand that it makes it easier for them to follow along, they start to notice it when it's different. Or even other teachers, they would say, Mr. So-and-so wants us to copy the slide. And, you don't want them doing that. But it made me glad, because they understood the benefit of it. Like that you really can't write and listen at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's when you know you've done anything enough, is when someone else doesn't do it in your room, they're bothered.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll mention as we kind of move forward to the next thing is I had a chance to ask the very famous Douglas Fisher, about that note-taking question when I was at teacher school one day. And he mentioned, and I think he's echoed it in their book, Improving Adolescent Literacy, how important you need to look at notes as both process, having a process function of you're engaged in the moment, it's driving your thinking in the moment, but then also a product function where the Cornell notes, and he emphasized, is Cornell notes is not this three looking, it's just, that's not just the way it looks, it's a process thing where you go back later and summarize it, or you go back to notes and fill in gaps. And some of what I've read recently about in learning theory about retrieval practice and the forgetting curve emphasizes how important that is to learning as well. Going back and going, okay, here's what I captured that first time. What can I add to it? How can I use this? How can I improve this? And how can I apply it forward, right? If they're taking notes on intros, how can I apply this forward to my introduction? So having it be purposeful and valuable as well.
Right, valuable, that they can see the value in it. And I just thought of this as you were saying that about right now, COVID-19, this won't be forever, but for this moment, our church is streamed. And because it is streamed, the notes that the pastor is using are in the notes alongside the sermon. Well, if I'm sitting in church, they're not. There's like a PowerPoint here and there, but it's really me taking notes for my own edification, and I'm taking notes on what I think is important. Well, now I can see his notes. So now I am obsessed with making my notes right for church. And I am looking at that notes thing, and I'm like, well, I didn't organize that the same way. Okay. And then I'm like, wait, what? You know, I'm 52 years old, and I cannot listen to him and look at the notes and do both at the same time. And so last week I went, I'm not getting anything out of this. I'm turning off the notes, and I'm going to force myself just to sit here and listen. And it was such a good reminder. Like, if I can't do it, they can't do it. So yeah, it's such a real life example of how distracted we become when we're trying to get the notes down, and we forget that, you know, you're going to throw those notes away. You know, even if you move 15 times and that's when you throw them away, eventually those are going to be thrown away. It's about learning.
That's true. Yeah, that's so true. I hadn't thought about that before. Yeah, it's the process and the practice, right? You're practicing thinking in a way that is most effective. So you mentioned it before we kind of went on our note-taking tangent. You mentioned it, huh? Yeah. So you mentioned shifting from, hey, here's my brief focused lesson, and shifting into guided instruction. And kind of, you had that kind of real fluid where sometimes it's real guided instruction of, hey, Johnny, you need to come sit next to me. Or if you have them in groups and you're going to them, or they're sitting next to your desk, that's important. Or the buddy up, right, where it's more of a collaborative learning thing, or saddle up where they're independently learning. And you gave them some choice with that. Could you talk a little bit about how you would do that? I remember the first time you told me about it, using that in my class and it being really helpful.
So yeah, I did buddy up, saddle up, round up, and then I had the kids just mark at the bottom of their paper what I called task points, and I just had them number 1 through 5. And honestly, when it started to get a little loud and I thought they were maybe off task, I'd ring a service bell. And when I rang that bell, they had to put a plus if they were on task and a minus if they were off. And I told the kids that it was worth points. It was not, basically what I was trying to do was getting them back on task. They'd hear that bell and they'd go, oh, okay, we were talking, okay, we'll get back on task. Yeah. So that was just kind of a nuts and bolts thing. The other way, and I think this is what you're referring to as well, is I also said, I've got 5 kids who are struggling with paragraphing. And 5 would probably be in the low number. And in that case, I would say, okay, guys, I'd get everybody to work. And then I would say, okay, I need Beau, Jill, Susie, Johnny, Jose, and Sam. And that group needs to come back and sit with me, and I'm going to show you some things about paragraphing. And what was interesting about that is my top kids really had the opinion that they were never, ever going to get, guided support because they didn't need it. Because, I'm Gate, I'm me. But those same kids were struggling with paragraphing. And I was actually that kid. I really had trouble figuring out where to put a paragraph. So sometimes I'd done the mini lesson and there were kids who just hadn't gotten it. And I would just call back whoever I needed by the skill they were missing. And again, that was like the grade equalizer, because I'm not judging this based on, you read above grade level. Either you have the skill or you don't. So that was one way I did it. And then I think two, and make sure that I'm answering this thoroughly. I also had a time where I used a consultancy model where I was the doctor, I was working with them on their writing, and they would meet with me one-on-one and we would talk about their writing. Written feedback isn't helpful. That is from Sheridan Blau's work. And what I found was I would give kids all kinds of written feedback. It would take me hours and hours and hours, and they would look to the back page to see what grade they got. And it just made me crazy thinking about how much time I had taken giving that feedback, and it didn't transfer. And I also remember that as a student, I had a teacher who wrote awkward next to one of my sentences in 10th grade. And I knew it was an awkward sentence. I knew it was awkward when I wrote it, but I didn't know how to fix it. And so again, the problem with feedback is I've given you the best writing I have. So feedback doesn't help me to know what to do next. So two things about feedback and kind of helping the kids make a difference. The first one is the really easy one where you have them bring their question to you. So I would have them, read their paper twice out loud to themselves and do it in a different color. So a different color pencil. So I could see that they had read their writing twice on their own. And then they would work with other students and they would read their paper to that other student. They didn't physically trade papers. So I'm reading my paper to Beau, and Beau is looking over my shoulder and saying, Jill, think about this, this, and this. So when they came to talk to me about their writing, they were only bringing me their questions and I was answering their questions. And that was really helpful because what I found was a lot of times kids were giving me their first draft. And I still find that in grad school. If I've got enough errors on the first 3 or 4 pages of something, I will give it back to the student and say, you've given me your first draft. Because a lot of what we miss as writers is just because we haven't attended to the task. When I make a typo, it's not because I don't know how to spell it. It's because I haven't paid attention to proof it.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. And then the other piece of that with feedback is my favorite thing with technology. So now I can say, pull out your paper and I'm going to now talk to you about what I saw as your reader. So I can actually in video have them go to the first paragraph and I give them feedback on the first paragraph. I can go to the 4th paragraph and say, look at the 4th paragraph and this is what I'm seeing. So that benefit is huge because that is so time saving. And that is essentially the consultancy model that I used to have to do face-to-face. So that is something really cool.
Did you, when they brought you your question, did you guide them a bit on like, here's the kind of questions you need to ask yourself? Because sometimes I think the kids, but I know an important thing you mentioned is, hey, they went through it twice. They shared it with someone else. So they really thought about what, they value. Okay, we got to treat this one-on-one time valuable as being valuable. But sometimes I think kids go, is this good? Is this good? Like they don't know how to ask a good question about their piece. Sure. So would you coach them on that or kind of nudge them a certain way?
Yeah. So I divided it into an organization question, like a communication question, and then like a kind of punctuation mechanics kinds of questions. And I had to teach them how to figure out how to ask those questions because this is what they would ask me. Because the way I worded it is, what problems can't you solve? And then we'll solve them together. So they would come and say, the problem I can't solve is my writing's bad. I'm not good at this. I don't know how to write. And so obviously they're not reflective enough or sophisticated enough to know what to ask. So I really did go through with them. Did I engage the reader in my intro? So I gave them a rubric that we made together that they had marked. I'm glad you brought that up. We built a rubric for every piece of writing that we did. And when I say we built a rubric, I don't mean we built like a college level rubric. I said to the kids, okay, we're going to write a response to literature. what would be a good response? What would you expect to be in there? And the kids would say, well, it needs to be long enough. No, I'm not asking about the mechanics. I'm asking about the communication. What would you want to communicate if you were talking about why Anne Frank was heroic? Well, you should have some examples where she's heroic, okay? Okay, you should say what heroism means, okay? You should have at least one quote. So now we've made a rubric, and you have to use that rubric to judge your own writing before you come to me.
Okay. With that rubric, is that rubric kind of similar to, I've run across the term anchor chart?
Yep. That's
Okay.
exactly what an anchor chart is.
Where you look at, hey, here's a mentor text. This is what this kind of piece does. It should have this, this, and this. Here's how to make it really good. Okay. I gotcha.
So that's essentially, we've gone through a mentor text. We've looked at what the author did. And then now I have a little checklist for myself. And what I found was they became very skilled at knowing what it looked like when it was done well, when I did a mentor text first. So I would say, okay, we're going to mimic E.B. White. I had a great essay from E.B. White that I used. And the kids would say, oh, he uses an example there. And then he ends that with a question. That's really a neat way to do that. Okay, so let's put that in our rubric. And that was really helpful to them. And I've heard this example used about counterfeit. The way you find a counterfeit bill is not by feeling what a counterfeit bill feels like. You learn what a real bill feels like. And so you have touched so much money that when you touch a counterfeit, you know it's not real. And it's the same thing with writing. I'm teaching you what good writing has in it, not telling you what good writing isn't. So I need an example, not a non-example. You know, the one I remember in high school was don't use a run-on.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, I'm not completely sure what a run-on is. I won't use one. If you show me what it is and tell me how run-ons work, I'll avoid it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It goes back to your point about comparing and contrasting is such an important learning thing. And that's exactly what you're doing to mentor. So it's like, hey, I'm going to do more of this because that makes it similar to the mentor task, right? Or I'm going to avoid this because I can see that as being different and maybe problematic. I've heard similar things about feedback, really focusing feedback on mining. I've heard the phrase mining successes, or pushing them and encouraging them to push into what they're doing well and kind of build on that, rather than kind of cut this off or cut this or don't do that. And if you do that, always start with, hey, let's build upon what you're doing well and what's going right.